this evening, so you should be able to visit them when you get home and see all the text, watch all the clips, gather as much information as you would like. You can also comment on any of the pages as you read them. Our final presentation, last but certainly not least, our largest group with a very big topic, uncovering the movement and exploration of civil rights in Fort Worth. Miles Davison, Johnny Kirk, Madison Scott, and Imani Suber.
All right, how's everyone doing?
Good.
Good. Y'all hanging in there? Yeah. No one's falling asleep on me, right? Okay, good. Ours is pretty important. So I'm Madison, and we have Imani, and we have Johnny and Miles. So, as Max said, we are uncovering the movement and exploration of civil rights in Fort Worth. So we have the opportunity to go out into the community and interview these fantastic people, and just to hear about their lives and their stories, but just how different it was back then compared to now, and how they got to where we are now. You know, everything they went through, it affected their education, their community, their neighborhoods, their politics, and it's all been transformed because of them to have what we have today. So I'm going to go ahead and pass on to Donnie here to tell you all about Jim Crow.
Perfect. All right, so this part of our website, what I'm pretty much going to cover is Jim Crow and how it affected Fort Worth in general. So Fort Worth has always been seen as a Western city with Western traditions, but Jim Crow definitely lived in Fort Worth. There was a lot of experience with Jim Crow here in Fort Worth. Although the institution of slavery was outlawed, the racism that still embedded slavery still was in Fort Worth. Some examples of these things were neighborhood and public space integration, school integration, the poll tax that we had to pay, or they had to pay during Jim Crow, literacy tests they had to use to vote, derogatory language, and even worse, lynchings that occurred in the city. We're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Jim Crow. The second point we have is going to be schools. During Jim Crow in Fort Worth, a lot of the schools, especially the black schools, received very low funding compared to the white schools. So they also had very few resources for books and for education to educate the blacks that were in Tarrant County. That in turn, of course, with a good education, it leads to a better job. So it was very hard for blacks to have a good job during this time. Another big thing is going to be the community in Jim Crow and building up the community. It was very difficult during this era for blacks to progress in the community. They had to kind of form their own little, their own community to kind of help each other out. They also had a lot of different, like especially during political times and economic hardships in the Jim Crow era, they really helped each other out. This little clip we're going to show right here is Reverend Lloyd Austin. He's going to describe some of the treatment during the Jim Crow era, what he experienced here in Tarrant County.
And how did that make you feel when you were younger? Did you realize that there was that big of a difference between the blacks and the whites?
Yes.
What things really brought that to your attention at such a young age?
Well, we knew we couldn't go into places where white people would go. Like if you want to go to a cafe, you couldn't go in the front door. Me. Go on what they call the back door, eat in the kitchen. But what always got me about that, if you ate in the kitchen, you ever seen them big old tables they had back to cut meat and stuff on? I don't know if you see them now. But they had them back there in the kitchen where they cut meat and whatever the vegetables. Well, you could go back there and eat. But up the front, the same price that those white people were paying, you had to pay it back there in the kitchen. That made me all feel all bad. Why can't you cut my price if you're going to feed me in the kitchen? Like my dog or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but they charge you the same price.
So that clearly shows Jim Crow experience from Reverend Austin here in Tarrant County. Another one, further down on the Jim Crow section, we have a little page about economic life. Many in the black community had to bound together and kind of create their own economic means for survival because the white society was not helping them out at all, especially during this time in Tarrant County. And then our last section in here is going to be churches. Churches were a center point of African American communities during the Jim Crow era. It was a place for them to feel safe and also to have political power. A lot of political leaders, many organizations and town meetings were held in the basements of many of the churches here in Tarrant County. Here, Commissioner Ward Brooks is going to talk about the power of the churches and its effects on the African American community during Jim Crow.
Churches were the major centers of power in the black community. Still are, though not to the extent that they were then. So inevitably the churches were involved.
So that kind of gives you a basic overview of how Jim Crow, kind of a little history behind it and how it was in Tarrant County. Our next presenter is going to be Miles. He's going to actually talk about the movement in Tarrant County and specifically the activism that happened here in the city.
All right, so I'm just going to give you guys a brief overview of the civil rights movement. And broadly, as Donnie was talking about, the effects of Jim Crow on communities across the nation really inspired a lot of changes during the 1950s and 60s. And it is known as the civil rights movement. And through that, it was really centered around community organization. And so some formal organizations that were created during this time are known as like the NAACP, SNCC, the SCLC, and the Black Panther Party, just to name a few. And so a lot of these organizations address the various problems that were present due to Jim Crow. And so the first one that I'm going to highlight really is education. And so even after the Brown versus Board decision in 1954 that mandated the integration of all public schools, Fort Worth did not seem to follow that notion. And this is kind of highlighted in a clip by Bob Ray Sanders right here.
But I was in the first grade when the Supreme Court declared in Brown versus Board of Education. I still went through 11 more years of segregated education because they did still, Fort Worth bought it. In fact, the year Brown, there was one high school in Fort Worth for black people prior to Brown. That was I.M. Terrell, historic I.M. Terrell, goes back to 1882, school for blacks. What the Board of Education did to try to get around Brown, they went into executive session, came out and says, we're going to build 3 new black high schools. So they started that year adding a grade a year to the 3 black junior high schools. And until about 1957, all of them were, we had 4 black high schools. So by the time I got to high school, there were 4 black high schools. I was still going to the one at I.M. Terrell. But that's how they did it. And so school integration, it really didn't start here. It was started in 1962 with what they call a stair-step plan. They were going to integrate 1 grade a year, beginning with the 2nd grade. 1st grade would be the last one integrated for 12 years. But by 1966, they decided to go on and try to integrate all the schools, or at least take down the barriers. They still remain segregated in many ways, as they do today.
So we can see through that clip, it took a while for education to actually finally get integrated in Fort Worth, and that was actually around more than 15 years after the Brown decision for Fort Worth schools to actually be fully integrated. And so next I'm going to talk a little bit about the neighborhood integration. And so during this time, neighborhoods around the country were segregated. And here in Fort Worth, actually, when blacks would try to move into different neighborhoods, they were actually met with resistance. So oftentimes what would happen is that if a black family moved into a neighborhood, they could possibly be met with like hostility and in some cases bombings. And here, Ms. Marjorie Crenshaw right here expresses her familiarity with bombings in her neighborhood.
Across Evans,
Okay.
they bombed the house.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, and they blew the porch out. And then on the corner of Evans and Murphy, right down here, when you go to Evans this way, and the corner of Morphy. They were going to do a bombing, I think. But some way, somehow, it was, somebody saw them or stopped them. And the next time, my minister, at that time, Jacob Carruthers, and a group of men got inside the house on Morphy before night. And whoever was planning the bomb, they had their rifles. And there was blood on the sidewalk the next morning. Now, we don't know what happened, and we don't know who did the shooting, but they never did that again. That was the end of it.
All right, so as we can see here, there was some difficulty in that nature, but ultimately the neighborhoods did eventually integrate as like, it was just kind of inevitable as integration was taking hold in other areas, that neighborhoods would de facto integrate as well. And so on from that, one of the biggest parts, and as the two previous groups also touched on, is political power. And so in during Jim Crow era, there were things such as poll taxes and literacy tests, which really had a hard time on black communities in general. And Ms. Opal Lee right here expresses her memory of the poll tax.
And another thing I did was to pay a poll tax. $1.75. It was the hardest $1.75 to give up, you know? And I'd wait till the last minute to pay it. But I did, so that I could vote.
All right, so we can see there that there were some barriers to political power, but ultimately, as like some of these things started to become eradicated through like national legislation, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, blacks started to get more political power. Now here in Fort Worth, there were actually two kind of paths that were taken in the political power. One was done as a more like individualist route, and it's actually highlighted by Mr. Reedy Perry, who actually was more concerned with like developing yourself educationally and economically, and it actually worked well for him as he was the first black person elected to the school board in 1974, and then in 1979 he was actually elected to be a Texas representative for District 95. I mean, he speaks here about some of his victories as a state representative.
Black doctors couldn't even practice here in Fort Worth, in the hospital. Yeah. Jack Brooks and all them with top doctors here, man. While there, I'm gonna show you this one. I have to show you this one. While there, almost turned here. I took on the Harris Hospital, all the guys here. And the letter I wrote there, and all the grievances, I had a meeting down there, all the grievances the black doctors had what they could. And when I went down there, because I was there again, you don't know me, I had, if this hadn't worked, I had a class action suit coming. My lawyer's already working on it, baby. Yeah. But I worked with Earl Cox. Now he and I were pretty good, because I had worked with him before, but he was chairman of the board over there. At Harris Hospital. And I took on St. Joseph and all of them. That's just me. And they just started changing, boom. And that's when black doctors began to get back in and could practice in the hospitals in Fort Worth. Yes, sir. Read Kerry.
All right, and so like that's just one example of what we do. The other example is actually more to do with the people themselves. And so like I said, after the Voting Rights Act of 65 passed, black people could register to vote in larger numbers. And what this did in turn was allow the coalitions to form between blacks, browns, and liberal whites. And it actually did a lot around the country to actually create the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And so especially in Texas, that was when there was a shift as Texas was primarily Democratic, and the more conservative people in the Democratic Party then switched to the Republican Party, and it kind of worked to form what we have now today in terms of those two parties. And so finally here, there was also other efforts to advocate for civil rights in Fort Worth. And like as with the Black Panther Party, as I mentioned earlier, the Black Panther Party moved through more aggressive tactics to advocate for civil rights. Now here in Fort Worth, there was a group called the United Front that actually used similar tactics of more confrontation.
Late 60s, and yeah, I remember the United Front well. Many of my friends were members of the United Front. And had I gone to college here, I would have been a member of the United Front.
And what exactly was their mission and what were their goals?
It was an activist organization of young people whose goal was to get equal rights. One of the things that they pushed for was integration of the newsrooms at the Star Telegram and the various TV and radio outlets. Jobs at the city of Fort Worth. Back during that time, a black man couldn't even drive a garbage truck.
Yeah.
So those were some of the things that they were.
And did they?
And there's still some of those guys still around.
Okay. Okay. And were their tactics any different than from like what you would see from the stuff that your father?
They were much more confrontational.
Okay.
Though not particularly violent. But they would get in the cops' faces. And not back down.
And not back.
See.
All right, so we can see here their methods of operating were much more confrontational, and it actually put a lot of pressure on the city because Fort Worth has always been a city that tries to kind of like keep everything under control, and so the threat of potential outbreak from groups such as the United Front really caused them to kind of like come to the table and compromise and things of that nature. And so lastly here, just in terms of the movement in Fort Worth, the Fort Worth Civil Rights Movement has always been kind of a child of the movement over in Dallas. Now Dallas experienced a lot more centralized organization and had a lot more of the formal civil rights organizations present over there. And they did many more like sit-ins and protests and direct things like that. That stuff still happened in Fort Worth, but it was much more present in Dallas. So it's always good to keep in context the Fort Worth movement and its relationships in Dallas. And so just to conclude here, I'm going to pass it off to Amani.
When we look at our conclusion, there are 4 key elements that went into our research of the civil rights movement in Fort Worth. The first one is that Fort Worth always kind of had the characterization of being a Western city, but that was not true because Jim Crow laws were very much prevalent, and blacks felt the full brunt of that. The second was because they had to combat Jim Crow, there were many local organizations that kind of banded together to help support blacks in the Fort Worth community. And the other thing was the movement was kind of sporadic within the city. So there would be protests and different things going on, but one of the problems was that they weren't really in sync with each other. And that really is why Fort Worth never had kind of a big movement that happened. And our 4th element is that although there was no mass movement in Fort Worth, like in Birmingham or Selma or Little Rock, there were a lot of individual people who contributed. And so they contributed to public policy, trying to get the major civil rights acts passed, and they worked on school desegregation and trying to get into the right to go to parks and the right to, eat in restaurants and shop in grocery stores. And so that's kind of what sums up our presentation. But one quote that we wanted to do was a quote from Commissioner Roy Brooks, and he kind of talks about the future of the movement and our responsibility to kind of pass the baton and keep it going.
The movement is ongoing.
Yeah, well, yeah, which I personally agree with too. But I mean, just in terms of like everything you've grown up with, the people that were making all of these efforts to better the community and better Fort Worth, and ultimately,
Theirs are the shoulders upon which we stand. They blazed the trail. And I was a part of that next generation. And my children are a part of that next generation. And on it goes, from generation to generation. And the obligation of each generation is that when they are past the baton, they run as far and as fast as they can and accomplish as much as they can until it is time to hand that baton off to the next generation.
I mean, and what we kind of took from that quote in our interview with the commissioner is that, you know, us as young people in our generation, we just can't be complacent with what's going on in society, that we've got to keep the movement going and we've got to find inspiration to get out into the community and do whatever kind of activism that we can to make the world a better place and to make sure there is equality for all. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you all for coming and listening. Thanks to our interviewees who, you know, gave us their time to uncover the history. So thank you.